recognized their phrase, the Palestinians' right to self-determination, and they did not rule out in this connection the establishment of a Palestinian state with limited sovereignty in areas excluding major Jewish settlement blocks in the occupied territories. Well, the diplomatic maneuverings that followed are familiar, at least in general outlines. I'll skip them. Today, it's commonly argued that the two-state consensus is no longer viable as a result of U.S.-backed Israeli programs in the territories, so that Israel will effectively incorporate them in some kind of one-state settlement. For Israel, that poses what's called the demographic problem, too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. And for Palestinians, it opens the way, it's claimed, to a civil rights anti-apartheid struggle. There's a typical formulation from the Israeli side, one of many. A security specialist, Yossi Alfer, warned a Jewish audience in Canada last month that Israel's on a very slippery slope as it takes over more and more land in the West Bank. It's rapidly moving towards a one-state reality, abandoning the liberal Zionist ideal of a Jewish and democratic state, choosing to become Jewish rather than democratic. That's his words. The conclusions on all sides, incidentally, are very dubious. Israel's settlement programs have been designed from the start to avoid the demographic problem, and they still are. In fact, the realistic alternative to this two-state consensus is continuation of those programs, gradually integrating within Israel the regions that are considered to be of value, removing the relatively few Palestinians who are there, and avoiding areas of heavy Palestinian population concentration. That's incidentally one reason why I think it's quite misleading to compare this to apartheid. It's much worse than apartheid. The South Africans depended on their black population. They needed them. That was their workforce, 85% of the population. In fact, they tried to make the Bantustans more or less viable, acceptable to international opinion. Israel's approach is quite different. Just get rid of them. Much worse. And if this continues with U.S. support, perhaps even leading to annexation, the greater Israel that is so constructed would probably have even less of a demographic problem than it has today. Just look at the numbers. Palestinians can then contemplate the fate of Milos at the hand of Athens, reported by Thucydides, the strong do as they wish, and the weak suffer as they must. And the crucial phrase is, with U.S. support. That may appear to be ironclad. It does have strong roots in U.S. society and culture, in military intelligence relations, in geopolitical considerations. But as I mentioned, public support is eroding. Policies might sooner or later reflect these changes. Well, the core interest of the United States in the Middle East, obviously, has been oil ever since the U.S. began to play a significant role in the region by intruding into the Red Line Agreement back in the 1920s, later taking over the Saudi concession after a conflict with Britain ran right through the Second World War. Earlier, the United States had expelled Britain from Venezuela, which by 1928 had become the world's leading oil exporter, with U.S. companies now in charge. The U.S. shelved its open door policy to achieve U.S. economic hegemony in Venezuela by pressuring its government to bar U.S. concessions. I'm quoting from the standard scholarly history. These actions conformed to the operative meaning of the open door doctrine, which was outlined, frankly, by the State Department in a 1995 1944 memorandum, which was called Petroleum Policy of the United States. It called for, I'm quoting it, the preservation of the absolute position presently obtaining in the Western Hemisphere, and therefore vigilant protection of existing concessions in United States hands, coupled with insistence on the open door policy of equal opportunity for U.S. companies in new areas. In brief, what we have, we keep, closing the door to others. What we do not yet have, we take under the principle of the open door. Now, that's actually not a bad illustration of really existing free market doctrine. By the mid-1940s, the U.S. planners recognized that Middle East oil was what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, and they understood the significance of strategic power, just as well as their British predecessors in world control, say the First Lord of the Admiralty, who informed petroleum technologists in 1921 that if we secure the supplies of oil now available in the world, we can do what we like. Securing the supplies includes control, even without need. Access is a separate issue. U.S. policies towards the Middle East have been stable, whether or not the U.S. sought access to the oil reserves. One clear example of this was a 14-year program initiated in 1959 that imposed mandatory quota restrictions so that the U.S. would rely on expensive Texas oil rather than cheaper Saudi supplies, with the long-range effect of seriously depleting the nation's petroleum reserves and imposing a substantial burden on consumers. That's quoting energy analyst John Blair. The scale was estimated by MIT oil expert M.A. Edelman at $4 billion a year. And in congressional testimony, Edelman harshly condemned these regulations as frivolous and as undermining national security, which is obviously true, but these considerations were outweighed by benefits for the Texas oil industry and members of Eisenhower's cabinet who cashed in on it. Now, that's 14 years of exhausting U.S. reserves in favor of cheaper Saudi oil, but the policies were the same: no access, but control. And the significance of control has been recognized by leading planners. So when the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq in 2003, Zbigniew Brzezinski pointed out that America's control over Middle East oil producers gives it indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region. So control over oil means control over Europe and Asia. Now, he was actually reiterating the observation of George Kennan, who recognized in the early post-war years that control of the resources of the Gulf region would give the United States what he called veto power over its industrial rivals. Happened to be talking about Japan, but the point generalizes. Another influential planner, A. Burley, held that control of Middle East oil would yield substantial control of the world. When the scale of the U.S. defeat in Iraq was becoming clear by 2007, Washington abandoned the pretexts of earlier years and announced very clearly what any rational observer should have understood at once, that the prime motive for the invasion was Iraq's enormous oil reserves and its strategic position at the heart of the world's major oil-producing region. There was a formal government declaration, November 2007, confirmed in a Bush signing statement the following January, It described Washington's goals as gaining a permanent military presence in Iraq and also preferential treatment for U.S. investors, of course, primarily energy corporations. Actually, neither goal was achieved, which is a further defeat. And the concern for securing oil resources brings us to the final phrase in the title of this talk, our collective fate. I'm not going to tarry on the evidence, which should be familiar, but our collective fate hangs by a thin thread on our ability to end, first, the use of fossil fuels, and second, the threat of nuclear war. Those are two grim shadows that hover over everything we consider. Fossil fuels have been the lifeblood of the Gulf states, the source of their wealth, and the satanic force that will soon render them uninhabitable as the climate inexorably warms. With unimaginable irony, they're surviving on the poison that's going to destroy them, unless it's mostly left in the ground. Very belatedly, Saudi Arabia is now at least considering a sharp change of course, diversifying the economy away from reliance on oil export. How realistic the prospects are, we do not know, but if you look at this morning's business pages, you'll see that they're committed to maintaining a high level of oil production. And skepticism abounds. One skeptic captured the mood by mock reporting that they split the electricity ministry and the water ministries for fear of electrocution. That pretty much captures it. The change of course is, of course, not eased by the pressure from the wealthy and the powerful to keep the wells flowing, and a huge sink for Western, including, of course, British arms producers. The unimaginable irony of surviving on the poison that will destroy us applies to the rich West as well, with dire consequences for the rest of the world, and indeed for other species. They're now being destroyed by global warming at the rate of the fifth extinction 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth, ended the age of the dinosaurs, opened the way to small mammals, ultimately humans, who are now playing the role of the asteroid. The oil age led to great prosperity in the West. It's also threatening to doom organized life on Earth, and not in the distant future, unless strong actions are taken, actions of which there are only limited signs. And in another irony, if that's the right word, the political party that dominates the parliament of the most powerful country in world history is dedicated openly to racing toward the precipice as quickly as possible. In the Republican primaries that have been going on in the United States, every single candidate opposed taking action to limit emissions and called for actions to increase them by scrapping regulations. That's also true of the current nominee. And in fact, all but one, marginal one, even denied that anthropogenic climate change is even taking place. And there's an impact already. The Paris negotiations last December aimed for a treaty limiting emissions. That goal had to be abandoned because the Republican Congress would not accept it. So what emerged is a voluntary agreement, of course, much weaker. Humans are reputed to be the only species with higher intelligence, and they have quite a strange way of showing it. The second major threat to our collective fate is nuclear war. And here, too, the U.S. relations with the Middle East have a significant impact. I'll mention only one example. It happens to be discussed in the arms control literature, but rarely noticed elsewhere, and an important example. The most important arms control treaty is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It hasn't been completely effective, but it has helped significantly to reduce the number of nuclear powers, which is not a trivial achievement. Non-nuclear states in the Middle East have imposed a condition on perpetuation of the NPT. If it's not met, they threaten to move on to nuclear weapons, destroying the treaty. The condition is establishment of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That goal has enormous international support, in fact, virtually unanimous. Leading the effort to implement this goal today is Iran, and its role as head of the non-aligned movement. The Arab states have been at the forefront of this demand from the beginning, 20 years ago. Those who express concerns about the alleged threat of Iranian nuclear weapons, for them, establishment of a nuclear weapons-free zone, a very straightforward method to alleviate these concerns. Repeatedly, there have been efforts to move forward toward this goal. In each case, the effort has been blocked by the United States, most recently by President Obama, with the cooperation of the UK and Canada. And the reason is not obscure. There's an article entitled, "Is There a Future for the NPT?" in the major arms control journal. Two leading figures in the arms control community, Jayanta Dhanapala and Sergio Duarte, observed that the effort was again blocked on behalf of a state that is not party to the NPT and is widely believed to be the only one in the region possessing nuclear weapons. That's an oblique and understated reference to Israel, of course. And they hope that the failure will not be the coup de grace to the long-standing NPT objectives of accelerated progress on nuclear disarmament, or worse, destruction of the treaty altogether. So in brief, for the US government and its two Anglophone allies who are trailing politely along, it's of such importance to protect Israeli nuclear weapons from scrutiny and control that they're willing to sacrifice the most important arms control treaty, the one that imposes the major barrier to terminal nuclear war. In such ways as these, our collective fate depends in no small measure on U.S. relations with the Middle East. Thank you.
Professor Chomsky, it just remains. Professor Chomsky, it just remains for me to thank you for a magnificent 40th George Antonius Lecture. You have started by taking us back to George Antonius himself, to a legacy of hopes and aspirations that periodic uprisings have brought to the Middle East, but how, regardless of the potent force of popular action, that the continued web of interests and of power abuses that have characterized Arab history in the 20th century continue to hinder the region in the 21st. And that this fateful web of American influence, global financial interests, you didn't lay any particular criticism against the cupidity of Arab rulers, but we might as well throw them into the mix, is making for a region whose problems seem farther from solution today than they did at the time that George Antonius wrote his memorable work. I don't thank you necessarily for raising our optimism, but you have served as a role model for all of us that we must not turn a blind eye to the fundamental problems of the region if we are to solve them, and that we must study them, we must share our results with the broader public, we must lobby to try and address the issues that we believe we can try and make a difference on. We must never succumb to the hopelessness of believing we can't in any way influence our future. And so though there isn't any short or quick solutions to the problems that you've outlined for us, you've certainly set some targets for us all to aim to struggle against, and to keep hoping that we might see a time where relations between the United States, Israel, and the Arab world will not be based on mutual exploitation or the abuse of power, but towards advancing mutual interests through mutual respect. It's a nice vision. We should all work towards it. Tonight we had some idea of some of the critical bases we must follow. Before we leave, I would like to ask our audience to please keep to your seats. I'll be escorting our speaker out briefly while you make your way to the reception, and then we were going to come and join you. But if you give us just 5 minutes to clear the room before you yourselves leave, I'd be very grateful. Before we go, will you please join me once again? Noam Chomsky.